Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation as part of the Industry Insight webinar series. The topic this time is Protect the Client, Protect the Firm, How Cybersecurity Risk Affects the Bottom Line. Speaking today will be Mark Sangster. Mark is an industry security strategist and cybersecurity evangelist who reaches, speaks, and writes about cybersecurity as it relates to regulations, ethical obligations, data breach incident response, and cyber risk management. Mark's 20-year career was established with industry giants like Intel, Cisco, and BlackBerry, where he worked on the first secure devices for government agencies. Mark continues to build mutually beneficial relationships with regulatory agencies and industry associations, drawing on his strong technical aptitude and intuitive understanding of information security. As an ILTA Council member, Mark regularly attends legal tech conferences, delivering talks and workshops, including a 23-stop ILTA Roadshow in 2017, and leads topical webinars focusing on cybersecurity challenges facing the legal industry. Mark is also a member of the American Bar Association, Income Security Advocacy Center, and the Association of Legal Administrators. He is also a National Law Journal Award recipient in 2016. The presentation today will be followed by a Q&A. Please enter your questions into the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. All questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We're recording this webinar and we'll be sending a video and a follow-up email in a few days. We'll also post a video on our blog at www.lawtechnologytoday.org. Thank you all for joining us. We'll now begin the webinar.
Thanks, Austin, and thanks everyone for attending today while we talk about how security risk affects the bottom line. And just very quickly, I am the industry security strategist working here with eCentire. We are a managed detection and response, a managed security services company that works with over 600 clients, and many of whom are actually in the legal space and spaces that are associated and related to legal, namely your clients. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a moment. And the reason I really talk about this is to tell you that many of the stories, with the exception of one slide today, come from our security operations center. So these are things that I've witnessed hands-on, where we have had to work with a client if it was a significant event, et cetera. So, I really don't want to rehash the old statistics. I want to give you that kind of first-person in the trenches view of really what all of some of the obvious costs are and risks to the bottom line of a law firm, and of course what all the hidden ones are, and the ones that are beneath the waterline, if we were to use the sort of proverbial iceberg metaphor. Now, of course, as we know, right, law firms, regardless of which list you look at, are cited as a top cybersecurity target. And, they're being targeted by various types of criminals and organized crime, in some cases, nation states. And I'm actually going to give you one of those stories today. Typically, I'd say they get too much headline time, but in this case, this is an important one with some very important lessons, I think, for all of us to take away. And then, of course, there's the insiders and there's your suppliers, right? So anyone within your third-party trusted chain, as you are a trusted vendor to your client, so too must be your vendors to you as a client. Now, as I said, law firms and the legal industry is certainly a preferred and popular target of cyber criminals. And if I look at some of the data that comes out of our security operations centers here, you can see that legal ranks about number 6. And there's a good news, bad news story in this that I love to tell. And one of them is that the legal industry is effectively on par with the finance industry. And where I think that's a good news story is that, financial services, banks, et cetera, it's where the money is, it's where the robbers go, has certainly taken the lion's share of regulatory beatings, right? They are that group that has had to sort of march to the most stringent of steps and pace compared to other non or less regulated sort of industries. And so for legal to actually be on par, that's a significant improvement that I've seen over the last couple of years, and certainly is a testament to the cybersecurity infrastructure you put in place, the efforts you put in place, and I think that the experts that you work with. So, the kudos are there. The downside, though, when we look at these numbers is that the number here where it says there are 17 exploits, that is actually per month per device that we have in the network. And what that means is typically law firms will see about 5 of these. So you can kind of 5x that number. We're now talking somewhere around 100, 1,000 to 1,200 in a year's sort of time. Well, these are the types of exploits that evaded all your other systems. They got through your firewall and your antivirus and your IPS, didn't show up on your SIM, right? They didn't appear in logging, and potentially caused some level of havoc. And this is where we actually had to go and intervene. So again, good news is, you're seeing about the same level of what the finance industry, which generally has very tight and restrictive cybersecurity policies and procedures in place. So that certainly tells you that you're doing a far better job than some of the other industries. Most namely would be biotech and healthcare, which have become of recent, the sort of the poster child of abuse at the hands of criminals peddling ransomware, as an example, and causing massive business disruptions and getting significant resulting payouts from it. Now, the bad news about that, of course, is that while the green bars here indicate that you see, as an industry over industry comparison, you can see up to 10% less of the sort of what I'd call a lot of the nuisance attacks, the background radiation, the internet kind of stuff. What you are seeing is a 30% doubling down on malicious code and targeted attacks. And really what that says is they've figured out that the kind of the broad sweep spamming types of attacks and broad phishing campaigns aren't working. Why? Because you've got better automated security measures in place. You may have better monitored services. You've done a great job of training your staff, et cetera. So they're now going into the very refined, honed, and targeted types of attacks. And those are the ones where they're now seeing more success. And this information this comes from our security operations, as I said, and I'm going to show you two slides here. One of them looks at it in a very typical sort of traditional security way of talking about a funnel where, you have all the raw events and that are generated up at the top going right down to the bottom where we see the kind of the escalations, which means we have to take some kind of action. And I wanted to compare a large law firm with, 700 plus attorneys, 20 locations, with a sort of a very typical sort of sized firm of more of, the 40 to 50 range of attorneys with one location. And what you see, as you would expect, is that the amount of signal, all that network activity and traffic that's generated is obviously, so it's nearly 50 times less for the small organization. So, I think really that's fairly intuitive. I don't think there are any surprises there. Now, as we filter down, though, what we do see is the same number of escalations. And this is run over a 90-day snapshot, and I've run this several times, and we come out somewhere in about the same sort of general area on the ballpark. And what's interesting about this is they're the same attack. So what we learned from this is it's really a corroboration of the preceding slide, which is to say, again, it's the very targeted, focused kind of attacks. Those are still the things that end up getting through and, become that kind of chaos monkey that's running around in your network or in your organization, causing that havoc where companies like ours are stepping in or you yourself are also taking remediative action. And another way to look at it is I wanted to step it up one level is to say, okay, so what's the interaction between security operations, be it internal or external, and how that affects the impact on your network and what kind of activity it results from it. And again, what we see is, the numbers get tighter and closer between large and small firms, right? The total number of security alerts that were driven was only an 8x. So that's down significantly from the 42x that we saw before. The number of security instances, it's still in that kind of that higher ratio level. Notifications, though, are only twice that for large firms as for small. So that's interesting. Out of all that, 2.7 million events that were generated in a large firm, you're only seeing twice the number of notifications. So again, what does that say? It means it's the good, very targeted, clever sort of things that are getting through. And then the disrupted connections, this is where, we actually took some action and we blocked traffic or we isolated devices on your network using endpoint controls and so on. And you only see what about it's a sort of a 4x there, right? So small firms, unfortunately, are still going to be plagued. And, the real question there that you have to ask is, if you're a small firm, yet you may have a large, big company type of client, like a bank, for example, or a hospital, you really do have to consider the fact that you also have big law firm kind of problems, right? You're going to have regulatory entanglements if something does occur, and you are going to have to provide the kind of security posture that a larger firm does. And that's a real challenge and a major consideration that should go into the cost of calculating the value of a lifetime of a client. Now, really why I think all of this matters as we shift into that. So what are the costs and, where do we kind of get to the meat of the presentation is that law firms are in a unique position as a nexus within the global and albeit our U.S. economy that, because of where you're centrally seated and the access you have to federal and state law, the fact that you help write that legislation and then you interpret it for your clients, you help them deal with the challenges of dealing with international law, with the EU, for example, and GDPR privacy rules that are coming into place, industry regulations like the SEC and HIPAA, dealing with cybersecurity requirements, contractual obligations, working with the investors that you help marry to their the industries that they then drive and the innovation that they fuel. So in technology and transportation and biopharma, et cetera. And it's because of this that you have a stronger duty of care, really, to protect not only you and your organization, your employees and your investors and your partners, but also your clients, most importantly, your clients. And that's why it's paramount, because you kind of have the reach and the access that most companies don't have. So what are some of the costs? Well, we're going to explore these in more use case detail here, but they fall into three broad buckets, right? There's reputational damage, there's the financial losses, and there's the regulatory penalties. Some of these obviously are very easy to put a dollar sign on. Some of the other ones aren't. When we look at business loss and so on, that's a little trickier and a little hard to judge, but we'll still talk about that a little bit. So the first one, of course, is the Panama Papers, and then, of course, the resulting Paradise Papers here, where we have seen significant political and publicity kind of play out of this. And this really does go to foster and fuel, no matter the focus of your practice. I mean, this is business registration and tax law in a sleepy part of the world, right, where we all want to go and lie on a beach and we don't really want to do work. And yet they became the global focus of interrogation and investigation and so on. And while I don't have a dollar figure for this, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to assume that these law firms are, if not already consumed, being massively consumed by the knock-on investigations, potential suits, lost business, etc. But here's an example that's far more easy to put a dollar sign on, and this is the case that happened about well, almost 2 years ago, I guess now, with the hackers that breached two very well-known law firms on Wall Street. And this goes back to my point about you with the special duty of care as the nexus of the economy. These firms were working with financial institutions. And the SEC actually came out and in the end ordered 3 Chinese hackers to pay $9 million in fines for allegedly front-running trades. And this is a real simple model to look at. As a law firm, you may have access to a data in a biotechnology firm that is funded by a private equity firm or invested in by a hedge fund, and you've now touched multiple points of the economy. And it's very easy to go after the law firm to steal press releases, for example. And if I can do that, then I can say, you know what, on Monday, when this biopharma company releases the FDA results of whatever testing they did on their new wonder drug, I know if the tests were successful, their stock will go up. I know if the tests were not successful, their stock will go down. Knowing that on Friday, I can front run that trade. That's a clear example of insider trading, and that's where the SEC, of course, has made the order. Now, to some degree, it is a bit of a joke, because I doubt that these fine gentlemen from Senju province are going to show up in Lower Manhattan anytime to be arrested by the district attorney. And of course, beyond that, the SEC themselves was then hacked. And I think what's more disrupting in this one is that the law firms themselves were not necessarily seen as the victim, right? They were trampled on by law enforcement. They were, dragged down the sort of proverbial streets of mainstream press, with the Wall Street Journal as a simple example. But nobody really looked at the fact that they themselves had actually been were the victim of crime. And that's an unfortunate scenario, but all too often the truth in these sort of knock-on kind of matters, where law enforcement and regulators and government are more interested in the larger crime, which is measured in the millions of dollars when it comes to the theft of money on public markets. And that's one simple example. There's been other examples of hackers paid to break into law firms. In one case, $110 million was allegedly made in illegal front-run trades, and a $30 million settlement was levied there. Of course, on the healthcare side, as I alluded to with biotechnology and biopharma, there's about 24 million in OCR fines were levied last year, which was a significant increase from the year over year. And the typical fines are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Unfortunately, they can reach into the millions. And as as part of healthcare, you have to realize if you are servicing that industry, it is governed by HIPAA, which is a very strict set of regulations around privacy and the protection of healthcare information and the financial information that's often tied. And they have caveats and rules for what they call business associates. Effectively, that's the third-party vendors that supply this industry, and that does include very specifically law firms. Now, this is a simple example of lost billable hours, and this was a law firm that unfortunately was plagued by a very well-known version of Tesla Crypt. They were hit over multiple days. Up to 60 attorneys were affected. It affected open and active cases that were at trial, and in the end, they admitted to losing about $500,000 in billable hours. You can also do back-of-the-napkin math if you'd like to calculate this for your own firm, which is to say, if we look at the AM200 list, every year, the average billable hour for an attorney is somewhere just south of $600, right? If you were down for 8 hours in the day, right, it's pretty simple math there. You're losing $5,000 a day per attorney, and it goes up quite steeply. So it's fairly simple to draw that conclusion, at a per attorney hour rate as to what the sort of lost billable hours are. And of course, that doesn't take into account all sorts of other financial losses. And I know these numbers are very steep, and I appreciate that. So this is the one slide where I'm drawing on third-party data, and this is a Poneman study called The Cost of Cybercrime, which was released at the end of 2017. But consider all the other knock-on or tertiary kind of expenses, right? So beyond things like if you have to do significant incident response activity and research and forensics work, there are those costs. But the costs of things like engaging crisis management, PR services, right? If you are bringing in investors in some case, remember, it's not just you. You may be central in a breach event, which now affects one of your significant clients. And because of that, your clients are doing things like having to train their employees, bring in board members for emergency meetings, put identity protection in place, et cetera, right? So these costs can go up. Their numbers estimate that it's $240 per record. I mean, that's fairly steep. But I think in higher profile cases that's fairly accurate. And what's worse is for some of these industries, so again, this may not be you specifically, but for your clients, is that the officers and board of these companies have a fiduciary care to protect the longevity and the health of the business. And one of those measures is certainly investor value. And we can see this survey again from Poneman that over time, we do see a dipping and a turnover in the actual stock value, or so the enterprise value, market cap of different companies across these different industries, financial services, insurance, and healthcare, and pharma, et cetera. Now, they do rebound. So in one way, I could look at this and say, well, if you're a smart fellow, you buy low and you sell high. So it does actually give you a reinvestment opportunity. And that is true. However, boards and board members are certainly going to take the ire of investors who have already put their money into this and are now seeing a significant downturn because of a cybersecurity event. So again, just think about what are some of the longer term, larger scope type effects that you are going to see, not just for you, not just your billable hours, cost of repair, et cetera, in the IT department, but the effect that you have on your clients. This story here is a case of, I don't know if everyone read this, but this is about China's pursuit, alleged persecution of a fugitive business person looking for asylum in the US, which actually led to some very sort of Jason Bourne type of activity. It makes for a great and interesting story. But related to that is an attack that we saw, a nation-state attack that we saw on a law firm. And this one was interesting. It actually started with stolen VPN credentials. It was detected through what we suspect PowerShell activity, and PowerShell is basically a very powerful and ubiquitous tool that administrators can use to remotely control and update and manage different employee systems, right, like laptops, et cetera. And the problem is, though, the bad guys also know about PowerShell and they use it all the time. And what they do is it looks like it's a normal administrative activity, but they're not. And here's a simple example. they give themselves administrative control. And once they have administrative control, they start creating other accounts. And then they create other accounts and they take things over. And this is exactly what they did. They were able to move through the organization. They were able to access the Exchange server, and they were tampering with it. And they were actually getting in there and affecting emails. And the reason they were doing it is they were going after a specific attorney who was involved in a very pointed and heated immigration case. We worked with another incident response firm as well, because this, of course, became a very in-depth, far-reaching investigation. And we were able to determine that it was linked, to the Chinese government, but interestingly, routed and ferreted through Russian IP addresses to try and obfuscate the original actor. Because at this point, of course, the government's interest had become public and was a little hard to hide. And so for that reason, they were trying to make it look like it was another, shall we say, stereotypical or easy to assume, given all the other press that we have and political charge that we have around suspected or alleged Russian interference and other activities. So those of you who've seen other webinars that I've run or talks, is this is certainly an area where I focus, which is the regulatory duality of law firms, right? That while attorneys have ethical code of conduct requirements, yes, there's specific ones that somewhat relate, client confidentiality, of course, and having to keep up with technology. Yes, they relate to cybercrime. But really, the firm itself also has a responsibility, not just the state breach notification laws, depending on where you and your clients reside, but also, of course, whatever industry regulatory requirements there are of your clients. And sometimes it's not just your clients, it might be your client's clients. Unfortunately, we work in an interconnected web now. Very simple example would be, maybe you work with the supplier of leather that goes onto seats for a car. So there's a seat manufacturer who then sends that on to the big manufacturer. And those manufacturers may be doing work, say, for the military. And because of that, they will also have more stringent requirements. Now, to protect ourselves, unfortunately, because of time, we're going to have to breeze through this, but I give this to you for reference. The Bar Association, of course, has put out their very good cybersecurity handbook. They did, released the second edition at the end of last year. They've really, I think, tightened it up, put in broader regulations and recommendations, I think, which are fantastic. They break down into these categories that I've listed here, the 7. I think it's a fairly good overarching kind of approach. It is, maybe not as in-depth as NIST or HIPAA, but you know what? I think you're hitting a lot of the high notes. And from that perspective, it is certainly a tool that we use a lot with clients to help them determine their security posture, look at where there's gaps, and then, determine how they prioritize closing those gaps. What's good about this as well is that they break this down into considerations for large law firms and small law firms. And again, because of time, we're really not going to dig into these. But what I do want you to think about is a small law firm isn't going to be held to the same standard as a large law firm. There's no way, right? A small law firm will not have the financial and technical wherewithal to put the same kind of protection mechanisms and services and staffing, et cetera, in their firm as a much larger firm would. The challenge here, again, as I said, if you have clients who sort of have those big company problems, then unfortunately the small law firm inherits those big company responsibilities, and that's the real challenge. And for larger law firms, I think there's an opportunity here to take that security first posture, where particularly when you have a governance or a risk management practice, that you can show that you are going beyond minimums. And really, at the end of the day, where that line of reasonable care is, I don't know. It's a slightly fuzzy line. I think there's some good debate here. Unfortunately, right now, I see it being tested in courts, and I see it being established by insurance companies. And I would really, push that the industry starts to put some bars in place, and I think, or lines in place. And I think the ABA has started to do that here. Stronger recommendations and perhaps language is the right way to go to drive this, which will, I think, prevent a kind of a larger disaster that may end up leading to more stringent regulation and associated costs. Now, again, I want to think about attributing value to security. And, there's lots of ways to think about this, but over time, this has evolved. And anyone, I can go into this in greater depth later, but anyone who has, invested in technology and services understands how we're marching kind of down a path and it's constantly changing. And another way to look at it is to consider it that hierarchy. There is no right answer here again. You sort of have to figure out, where do you need to get? How much do you need to invest to know that you're adequately protecting your clients. And this is a very standard security maturity model that we would use. And you really kind of have to figure out in these 5 rows from risk management down to reporting and metrics, where do you need to be? Where do you feel comfortable? You know you've mitigated your risks, and where do you know you're adequately protecting your clients? And I'm going to leave you with a couple of quick thoughts here in our quick visit, is that I want you to consider that what you can see is only a small part of the picture. As I said to you earlier when I showed you that security operations data, all of that information, all of those numbers were generated, and it's in the order of billions, after all those traditional systems like antivirus and firewall and et cetera. And the reason I say this is I think if you want to fall back on a sense of security is to say, hey, man, you know, we bought all the basic security tools that we thought we needed. You know what? So did Target, and so did a lot of other companies who have seen this already. And those have been proven out now to not meet the measure of care, to be able to say, yeah, that's great that you put those in place. The worst part of that too is, of course, if you haven't patched them, if they're not updated, et cetera, that may be shown as a weakness. And from there, an insurance company, for example, may exploit that and use that to refuse a claim. What's worse is, of course, it's all the things that you can't see, right? The rest of the signal that's out there. And that's the thing that plagues. That's the types of attacks that we end up seeing, the escalations and the reporting and the alerting and the response that we take is all in this spectrum. It's the stuff that the naked eye can't see, right? And the simple analogy I have is, you know, we can't see ultraviolet light, but lie on a beach without sunscreen on, and you can certainly see its effects and prove that it's there. And that's very much the case of what that SOC data was trying to show. So, of course, I wanted to leave you here with, we have a bunch of documents and resources, and please reach out to Alana Arthur afterwards. And I believe that Austin's going to he's got some contact information that will go into the follow-up here. We have lots of documents around how you protect yourself, you know, whether or not you pay with ransomware, and there's lots of good answers, and that's a huge area for discussion. And we have workbooks and practice tools that we use that align to the ABA Cybersecurity Handbook. And if anybody would like a copy of that information or a copy of the ABA Handbook, please reach out to us and we'll get you a copy as soon as we can.